On the 1st of March, 2015, a robotic submersible drifted through a kilometer of darkness in the Sibuyan Sea and settled its lights on a rusted anchor stamped with Japanese characters. For 71 years, the largest battleship ever sunk in that ocean had lain undiscovered. This is the story of the Musashi, the sister ship of the Yamato, a vessel so secret that most of Japan never learned it existed, so powerful that 10 torpedoes might have been enough to sink her, and so heavily attacked that it took closer to 19. Two identical super battleships were built, and history remembers only one of them. The other absorbed a weight of bombs and torpedoes that would have shattered any aircraft carrier afloat, took nearly 4 hours to die, and then slipped almost entirely out of memory. This is why the second ship vanished twice. She vanished once beneath the sea, on a single afternoon in October 1944, and she vanished a second time from the story we tell about the war, where her more famous sister took all the memory and left the Musashi almost nothing. To understand how a ship this enormous, this expensive, this secret could be built, sailed, sunk, and then nearly erased, you have to go back to the decision that created her, a decision rooted not in strength, but in the certainty of coming defeat. That decision was made in January 1936, when Japan announced its withdrawal from the London Naval Treaty. The treaty system had capped the size and number of capital ships the great naval powers could build, and once Japan stepped outside that system, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a hard arithmetic problem. It could not match the shipyards of the United States, because American industry could simply build more hulls, faster, than Japan could ever hope to. Faced with that gap, the Navy chose a different path entirely. If it could not win on quantity, it would win on quality, and that was the logic behind the doctrine of the decisive battle, the Kantai-Kessen. The idea was to build individual warships so overwhelmingly powerful that a single one could defeat several American battleships in one climactic engagement, the kind of single crushing fleet action the Navy had dreamed of ever since its victory over the Russians at Tsushima in 1905. The design team made a specific bet about their enemy. They assumed the United States would never build a battleship too large to fit through the Panama Canal, because a ship that could not transit the canal could not move between the Atlantic and the Pacific. That assumption gave the Japanese constructors an estimated ceiling for American designs of around 63,000 tons, armed with 10 16-inch guns. Their answer was to build something larger than the Americans would allow themselves, and to arm it with guns no battleship had ever carried, and that answer became the Yamato class. The second ship of that class would be the Musashi. There is a pattern in organizational psychology that explains this decision better than any purely naval account, and it turns up in businesses and institutions right up to the present day. When an organization knows it is being outcompeted on the fundamentals, on scale, on resources, on raw output, it will often respond not by changing its strategy, but by doubling down on a single prestige project, a flagship effort meant to prove that quality can overcome quantity. The reasoning feels rational from the inside and looks like denial from the outside, and financial institutions have collapsed making exactly this bet, pouring everything into one grand initiative rather than confronting a structural disadvantage they could not fix. The Imperial Japanese Navy, facing an industrial giant it could never match hull for hull, made the same move in steel. The Musashi was that institutional gamble cast in 70,000 tons of metal. It helps to be precise about what kind of bet this was, because the logic sounds almost reasonable until you follow it to its conclusion. The Navy was not simply building a big ship out of vanity. It was wagering that a small number of unbeatable ships could substitute for a large number of ordinary ones. If a single Yamato-class battleship could stand in a gun line against 2 or 3 American battleships and win, then the numerical gap between the two navies would close. Every element of Japanese naval planning since Tsushima rested on the belief that the next great war at sea would be decided the way the last one had been, in a single massed clash of battle lines, with the heaviest guns landing the decisive blows. The Yamato and the Musashi were the ultimate expression of that belief. The The most perfect answer ever engineered to a question the war would simply refuse to ask. The design carried the internal name Project A-140, and it did not emerge cleanly. Two men shaped the philosophy behind it. Vice Admiral Yuzuru Hiraga was the conservative, a designer who favored a heavily armored central citadel that concentrated protection around the most vital parts of the ship, while Captain Kikuo Fujimoto was the innovator, willing to push further and accept more risk. The argument between those two approaches was settled by a disaster. In 1934, the torpedo boat Tamazuru capsized in heavy seas, a catastrophe that exposed serious stability problems in Fujimoto's designs, and Fujimoto was discredited by the incident and died in January 1935. Leadership of the design then passed to Rear Admiral Keiji Fukuda, a protege of Hiraga working within the 4th Section of the Naval Technical Department, and Fukuda's team completed the final design in March 1937. Construction of the second ship began the following year. The keel of the Musashi was laid down on the 29th of March, 1938, on slipway number 2 at the Mitsubishi Yard in Nagasaki. On the paperwork, she was not even called the Musashi. She was Warship Number 2, hull number 800, a deliberately anonymous designation meant to reveal nothing. From the very first steel plate, the ship existed under a false name, an administrative disguise that matched the physical curtain going up around her. She would be launched 2.5 years later, on the 1st of November, 1940, and commissioned nearly 2 years after that. A full 4.5 years separated the laying of her keel from the day she entered service, a measure both of her staggering complexity and of the plain fact that Mitsubishi, a commercial builder, had less experience than the Navy's own arsenal at Kure with warships on this scale. There is a principle in modern high-performance engineering that maps almost perfectly onto the choice Fukuda's team faced. In Formula One racing, every car is built against a minimum weight limit, and engineers fight over every kilogram, because weight added in one place has to be justified against speed lost everywhere else. A battleship designer works inside the same unforgiving equation, only inverted and enormous. Every ton of armor bolted onto the Yamato class had to be paid for somewhere else, in speed, in fuel range, in the sheer displacement needed to keep the whole thing floating. Fukuda's team chose armor over speed, and that single trade-off, made on paper in 1937, would decide how the Musashi lived and how she died. The Yamato was built by the Navy at Kure, while the Musashi was built by a private contractor, Mitsubishi, at its shipyard in Nagasaki, and that distinction created a problem. Kure was a naval arsenal, but Nagasaki was a commercial port, with foreign consulates sitting within sight of the slipway. Building the most secret warship in the world in plain view of foreign eyes demanded concealment on a scale with few equals in industrial history. Woven into an enormous screen, that fiber hung around the slipway and blocked the ship from view, and popular accounts claim the purchase ran so large it caused a national shortage in the rope and fishing industries. The secrecy reached the people as much as the materials. Workers signed oaths of secrecy, and roughly 1,800 police, Kempitai military police, and sailors patrolled the launch. A former escort carrier, the Kasuga Maru, was towed alongside to block sight lines from the harbor. Punishment for a lapse was severe, and a blueprinter who accidentally swept a single top-secret blueprint into the trash was reportedly jailed for 3 years over the mistake. There is a moment in the ship's construction that captures the sheer physical scale of what Mitsubishi had built, and it came at the launch. When the Musashi's hull slid down the slipway on the 1st of November, 1940, it weighed roughly 35,500 tons, and it struck the water of Nagasaki harbor with such force that it threw up a wave. That wave rose about 120 centimeters high, nearly 4 feet, and it swept across the harbor and up the rivers, flooding homes and capsizing small fishing boats. To keep the residents of Nagasaki indoors and away from their windows during this spectacle, the authorities staged a citywide air raid drill as cover. The hull itself traveled about 220 meters down the slip and had to be arrested by 570 tons of drag chains, stopping just about a meter past where the engineers had calculated it would. A warship being born generated a small tsunami, and the state disguised it as an air raid drill. The secrecy was not perfect. On the 20th of May, 1938, 6 bombers marked with Chinese insignia and manned by Russian crews flew over the yard and photographed it. And the imagery reached American naval intelligence, which reviewed it and failed to grasp the true size of what sat on the slipway. That failure of interpretation would persist for years. As late as September 1944, the reference Bible of the world's navies, Jane's Fighting Ships, still listed the ship at 45,000 tons. American Office of Naval Intelligence estimates ran between 40,000 and 57,000 tons, and as late as July 1945, the United States still believed the ship carried 16-inch guns. The real figure was 18.1 inches, and the Americans would not learn the truth until the war was nearly over. Consider what that curtain was hiding. The Musashi displaced 64,000 long-ton standard, and at full combat load, she reached over 71,000 long tons. Trials proved the design out, and on the 22nd of June, 1942, she made just over 28 knots at more than 70,000 tons of displacement, a staggering figure for a hull that size. Her main armament was the reason she existed: 9 guns of 46 centimeters, 18.1 inches, the largest guns ever mounted on a warship, arranged in 3 triple turrets. For secrecy, official Japanese documents deliberately mislabeled them as 40-centimeter guns. Each gun ran over 21 meters long and weighed roughly 147 tons, while a complete triple turret weighed around 2,700 tons. Let that number settle for a moment. A single one of the Musashi's 3 main turrets outweighed an entire contemporary destroyer, and each armor-piercing shell those guns fired weighed about 1,460 kilograms and could be thrown roughly 42 kilometers. Driving all of this through the water took power on a similar scale. The Musashi's engines produced 150,000 shaft horsepower, fed by 12 boilers and turning 4 propeller shafts, and they could push her past 27 knots. Crewing her took a small town. At the start of her career, she carried roughly 2,500 men, and by 1944 that number had climbed toward 2,800. When she sailed on her final sortie, her complement stood at 2,399, made up of 112 officers, well over 2,000 men, and a handful of civilians hired by the Navy. Every one of those numbers was a person who had to be fed, housed, and moved through a steel labyrinth so vast that officers got lost inside it. The guns were so large they created a supply chain problem with a distinctly modern flavor. The 46-centimeter turrets and barrels were too big to move by rail or by ordinary sea transport, and that is why the Navy built an entire specialized ship, the Kashino, for the single purpose of carrying the guns and turrets from the arsenal at Kure to the yard at Nagasaki. This is the same category of problem that today governs the movement of wind turbine blades or aerospace fuselage sections. Cargo so oversized that the transport infrastructure has to be purpose-built around the object itself. Back in 1940, Japan solved an oversized cargo logistics problem by constructing a bespoke vessel to carry components that no existing ship could handle. The protection matched the guns. The main armored belt at the waterline measured 410 millimeters thick, over 16 inches of steel, angled to increase its effective resistance, while the face of each main turret carried 650 millimeters of armor. Below the waterline, the hull was subdivided into 1,147 watertight compartments, the great majority of them beneath the armored deck. This was a ship designed on the assumption that she could absorb punishment no other vessel could survive. Hold that real figure of over 70,000 tons against what the enemy believed. For years, American intelligence badly underestimated her, and Jane's Fighting Ships still listed her at 45,000 tons in September 1944, only weeks before she was sunk. The Office of Naval Intelligence produced estimates ranging from 40,000 to 57,000 tons, which meant the Musashi was, in reality, some 15 to 30,000 tons heavier than the enemy, who was about to sink her believed. The curtain at Nagasaki had done its work so well that even in the final autumn of the ship's life, the men planning to destroy her did not know how large she truly was, or that her guns were 18 inches rather than 16. The Musashi was commissioned on the 5th of August, 1942, at Nagasaki, and here the story takes on a quiet irony that would define her whole career. By that August, the war in the Pacific had already turned on a weapon the Musashi was not built to fight. 2 months earlier, at Midway, aircraft launched from carriers had sunk 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The age of the battleship as the queen of naval battle was ending precisely as the greatest battleship ever built entered service. In January 1943, the ship joined the combined fleet, and by February she had replaced her sister Yamato as the fleet flagship. For a time, she carried the most important officer in the Japanese Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and Yamamoto departed the Musashi in April 1943 to fly to Rabaul, where on the 18th of April his aircraft was ambushed and shot down. He never returned to the ship. In June 1943, the Musashi received an even higher honor when Emperor Hirohito came aboard to inspect her, and the emperor rode the ship's internal elevator. This was a vessel considered fit to carry the sovereign himself. Through all of it, the Musashi never once fired her magnificent main guns at an enemy surface ship. She sat at Truk, at Brunei, at Kure, sortied and found no American surface fleet to engage, and ferried troops and equipment instead. The most powerful battleship in the world spent her career as a floating headquarters and a transport, waiting for a decisive battle that the aircraft carrier had already made obsolete. The waiting itself deserves attention, because it is the true tragedy of the ship, larger than any single day of battle. Commissioned in August 1942, she would not be sunk until October 1944, which meant more than 2 years of active service in the most intense naval war in history. Across that entire span, the 9 great guns at the center of her existence, the guns that justified every ton of her displacement, every yen of her cost, every meter of that concealing curtain, never fired a single shell at an enemy ship. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Musashi was present while Japanese naval aviation was gutted in an engagement the American air crews nicknamed a turkey shoot, and still she made no surface contact. 2 years of readiness. 2 years of the finest naval artillery ever built, all of it held in reserve for a decisive gun battle the enemy simply declined to fight, because the enemy had already understood that the decisive weapon was now the airplane. It is hard to convey the size of the Musashi in numbers alone, so listen to the men who lived inside her. An officer named Naoshi Ishida described the interior this way. Inside the ship, he explained, there were arrows telling you which direction was the front and which was the back, because otherwise you could not tell. For a couple of days, Ishida admitted, he did not even know how to get back to his own quarters. A grown naval officer, aboard his own warship, needed directional signage to find his bed. During construction, an engineer named Shigechi Koga looked at the hull taking shape on the slipway and remarked that it seemed like this battleship could never be sunk. That sentence would become one of the most haunting in the ship's history, because Koga was describing a belief, not a fact. The men who built the Musashi, the men who sailed her, and the enemy who studied her all shared a version of that belief. The ship looked unsinkable, and the trouble with the word unsinkable is that it has been proven wrong every single time it has ever been used. The sense that this was a ship apart, a ship of almost sacred importance, reached its peak in June 1943, when Emperor Hirohito himself came aboard to inspect her. The sovereign of Japan walked her decks and rode her internal elevator through the layers of the hull. Consider what that inspection meant in the culture of the time. The living embodiment of the Japanese state had judged this ship worthy of carrying him, and everything about the Musashi, her secrecy, her size, her guns, her cost, was wrapped in a sense of national destiny. Within 16 months of the emperor stepping aboard, the ship he had honored would be lying broken on the floor of the Sibuyan Sea, and the government would work to keep her death a secret from the very nation that had built her. The first crack in the legend came from beneath the surface. On the 29th of March, 1944, off Palau, the American submarine Tunny put a single torpedo into the Musashi, and that one hit tore a 19-foot hole in her hull, flooded roughly 3,000 tons of water into the ship, and killed 7 men. A single submarine torpedo, and the unsinkable ship was leaking 3,000 tons of sea. The Musashi went to Kourei for repairs in April 1944, spending roughly 2 weeks in the yard, and while she was there the Navy made a telling change. It stripped out some of her armament and packed her with anti-aircraft guns instead. The 2 wing turrets of 6.1-inch secondary guns, the ones borrowed from cruiser designs, came out, replaced by a dense forest of 25mm anti-aircraft mounts. Read that decision carefully. The Navy was quietly admitting what the doctrine would not say aloud, that the threat to the Musashi was no longer other battleships. The threat came from the sky, and the ship built to fight surface fleets was being frantically rearmed to fight airplanes, because the airplane was the enemy that was actually coming for her. Here is the bitter part. It would not be enough. When the day of reckoning came in the Sibuyan Sea, all those additional anti-aircraft guns, all that frantic rearming, would shoot down 18 American aircraft across an entire day of attacks, while the Musashi herself absorbed somewhere between 10 and 20 torpedoes and up to 17 bombs. The arithmetic of that exchange tells the whole story of the battleship's fate in the carrier age. A ship costing an unimaginable fortune, rearmed at emergency speed specifically to survive air attack, managed to trade her own life for 18 airplanes. The airplane had not just made the battleship obsolete, it had made the battleship a bad trade. By October 1944, the war had reached Japan's inner defensive line. American forces were landing at Leyte in the Philippines, and if the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from the oil of the southern resource area that fueled the entire war effort. The Japanese response was a plan of enormous complexity and desperation, codenamed Show 1 or Victory 1. The plan called for the Japanese fleet to converge on the American landings at Leyte Gulf from multiple directions. A decoy force of carriers under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would sail from the north, deliberately offering itself as bait to lure the powerful American Third Fleet away, while the real striking power, a force of battleships and cruisers called the Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would thread through the islands, pass through the San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the vulnerable American transports and landing forces. The Musashi and the Yamato were the heart of that center force, and after 2 years of waiting, the great battleships were finally being sent toward a battle. The plan asked an enormous amount of the center force, and the deepest irony of Show 1 is what it demanded of the great battleships. For 2 years the Yamato and the Musashi had been held back, too precious to risk, waiting for the perfect gun battle. Now, at the 11th hour, the doctrine reversed itself entirely, and the ships that had been hoarded were to be flung forward through narrow straits, under skies the enemy controlled, without meaningful air cover of their own, on a mission to reach the American beachhead at Leyte and destroy the transports before the landing could be consolidated. The most protected assets in the Navy suddenly became the most exposed. The decisive battleships were being committed not to a decisive battle at all, but to a desperate suicidal thrust against an enemy who owned the air above them. The center force departed Brunei on the 22nd of October, 1944, and 2 days later, on the 24th, it entered a stretch of water between the islands of the central Philippines called the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita's force had no carrier of its own overhead to fend off what was coming, and there, in that enclosed sea ringed by islands, with the American Third Fleet's carriers loose to the east, the American carrier aircraft found it. There was already tragedy aboard the Musashi before the first American bomb fell. The day before the Great Air Battle, the heavy cruiser Maya had been sunk, and hundreds of her survivors had been transferred onto the Musashi for safety. The largest, most heavily protected ship in the fleet must have seemed the safest place in the world to put rescued men. It was the worst possible choice, though no one could have known it, because those Maya survivors had been pulled from one sinking warship and delivered directly onto the ship the entire American carrier force was about to concentrate upon. At 8:10 on the morning of the 24th, a search plane from the American carrier Intrepid sighted Kurita's fleet, and for about an hour the Musashi tried and failed to jam the search plane's radio to stop it reporting the fleet's position. She could not. By 10:18, the Musashi's own lookouts were reporting roughly 30 aircraft inbound. The first attack came at 10:27. 8 Helldiver dive bombers from the Intrepid pushed over, for near misses bracketed the ship, and a single 500-pound bomb struck the roof of the No. 1 main turret. The armor held, and the bomb failed to penetrate. 2 minutes later, at 10:29, 3 Avenger torpedo bombers from the Intrepid came in low, and 1 torpedo struck the ship on the starboard side amidships. The Musashi took on roughly 3,000 tons of water and listed 5.5 degrees to starboard, and the crew counterflooded, deliberately letting water into compartments on the opposite side to level the ship, and brought the list back down to 1 degree. The damage control teams had passed their first test, but the American carriers were only getting started, and every wave that followed would target the same ship. From the cockpits, the sight was overwhelming. A gunner named Russ Dustin, flying from the carrier Franklin, described his first look at the target in the simplest possible words. The Musashi was huge, he said, and he had never seen anything as big in his entire life, and it was a magnificent sight. Another Franklin gunner, Joe Anderlich, could not believe how enormous the ships were. These were airmen who had seen the American fleet, the largest warships their own country could build, and the Japanese battleships still stopped them cold. They were looking at the thing the curtain at Nagasaki had hidden for 6 years, and now they were going to sink it. What followed over the next several hours was less a battle than a demolition. Wave after wave of American aircraft came in, and here lies one of the strange truths of that day. The Americans had multiple large Japanese warships in front of them, and yet wave after wave concentrated on the same target. The Musashi drew the fire. According to the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, the American carriers flew 259 sorties by dive and torpedo bombers against Kurita's force, but each wave kept attacking the same ship, the Musashi, over and over again. Around 2 in the afternoon, a second major attack landed a bomb that penetrated deep into the ship and reached an engine room, costing the Musashi her port inboard propeller shaft, and her speed began to fall. At 1:12, Kurita slowed the entire fleet to 22 knots so the wounded Musashi could keep pace, a decision that reveals the terrible logic tightening around the ship. She was becoming an anchor on the whole center force, and Kurita had to choose between protecting one battleship and pressing his entire mission forward. There was a strange and revealing episode in the middle of this ordeal. At 1:13, Inaguchi sent a radio message to Kurita that referred to a shell explosion inside the ship. What had actually happened, according to the turret crew, was that one of the Musashi's own Type 3 shells, an anti-aircraft round for the main guns, had rebounded, and the forward main turret was disabled and evacuated. Read what that means. The largest naval guns ever built, the entire purpose of the ship, were being used in a desperate attempt to throw shells at incoming aircraft, and one of those enormous rounds had malfunctioned badly enough to knock out the forward turret from the inside. The guns designed to sink battleships at 40 kilometers were reduced to firing anti-aircraft rounds at dive bombers overhead, and they could not even do that without wounding their own ship. The attacks kept coming. A third major strike of 29 aircraft from the carriers Essex and Lexington arrived in the early afternoon, landing more bombs and torpedoes, and the ship's speed dropped further to 20 knots, then to 13. By mid-afternoon, the Musashi was falling behind, her bow settling lower and lower into the sea as thousands more tons of water poured into the forward compartments her armored citadel was never designed to protect. Over the course of the day, the American aircrews paid a price too, losing 18 planes shot down by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire. But 18 aircraft against a battleship was a trade the American carriers were more than willing to make. There is a concept in the security of modern computer networks that explains what was happening to the Musashi better than any purely naval account. Defenders talk about an asymmetric threat, a situation where an attacker can strike at any point across a wide surface while the defender has to protect every point at once. The Musashi's armor was a concentrated citadel, superb protection wrapped around her vital center, her magazines and machinery, but her bow and stern, the ends of the ship, were far more lightly protected. The American torpedoes did not have to defeat the 410 millimeters of belt armor. They simply attacked the undefended surface, the unarmored ends, and let progressive flooding do the rest. It is the same principle by which a modern attacker ignores a hardened firewall and slips in through a forgotten, unguarded port, because the strongest wall in the world protects nothing if the attacker can simply go around it. This brings us to the great unanswered question of the Musashi, the one historians still argue over, which is how many hits it actually took to sink her. The honest answer is that we do not know, and the range of estimates is enormous. The initial Japanese report claimed 21 torpedoes struck the ship, including 2 duds. After the war, the United States Naval Technical Mission to Japan investigated the sinking in detail and reached a far lower figure, concluding there were around 10 definite torpedo hits, with as many as 4 more that were possible but not probable, and roughly 16 bomb hits. Most strikingly, the American investigators concluded that 10 torpedo hits, if evenly divided between both sides in the forward 3/4 of the ship, would have been enough to sink her on their own. Other authorities land elsewhere. The naval historians Garsk and Doolan put the figure much higher, at around 19 to 20 torpedoes and 17 bombs, and the United States Naval History and Heritage Command states that the Musashi absorbed at least 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes before she capsized and sank. Most Japanese sources settle on around 11 torpedo hits and 10 bomb hits. So the range across serious sources runs from about 10 torpedoes at the low end to 20 at the high end, and from 10 bombs to 17, which is not a rounding error. That is a doubling. The single most basic fact about the ship's death, the count of blows it took to kill her, has answers that differ by a factor of 2 depending on which record you trust. And every one of those records was compiled by people with reason to see the number their own way. The debate over the numbers connects to a deeper debate over why she took so long to die. And there are 2 competing explanations that historians run side by side. The first credits her design strengths, the vast size, the 16-inch belt, the more than 1,100 watertight compartments, all working exactly as intended to keep her afloat under an impossible weight of attack. The second explanation points at design flaws. The ship's armored citadel, the concentrated fortress of protection around her vital center, left her bow and stern comparatively lightly protected. Worse, her construction relied in places on riveting rather than full welding, and near misses from bombs could loosen those rivets and start progressive flooding through seams no direct hit had ever breached. The counter-flooding calculations her damage control officers relied on, the mathematics of deliberately letting water into one side to balance flooding on the other, have been described as over-optimistic. By this reading, the Musashi did not survive for 4 hours because she was superbly protected. She lingered for 4 hours while water crept relentlessly through her lightly armored ends and her loosened seams, a slow death rather than a heroic stand. Here is where the popular story of the Musashi deserves to be challenged. The legend, the one repeated in countless retellings, holds that the Musashi was so mighty it took an almost superhuman effort, some 20 torpedoes, to bring her down, and that this proves how magnificent she was. Look closely at what the American technical investigators concluded, that 10 well-placed torpedoes would have done the job. For comparison, consider what happened to the British battleship Prince of Wales in 1941, which was crippled and sank after only a handful of torpedo hits. The uncomfortable interpretation, argued in serious naval analysis, is that the enormous number of hits the Musashi absorbed does not prove she was superbly protected. It proves the opposite. Many of those torpedoes struck the same side, or struck the heavily armored center where they mattered least, and the reason she took nearly 4 hours to die was not that she was invincible. It was that the American attacks, spread across the wrong parts of the ship and clustered inefficiently, took a long and clumsy path to a result a smaller number of well-aimed hits would have achieved far faster. The 4-hour agony of the Musashi is not necessarily a monument to her strength. It may be a monument to how much ordnance it takes to sink even a poorly optimized target when you attack it without a plan. While the Musashi fought for her life, the commander of the whole center force faced a decision that would haunt the rest of the battle. Vice Admiral Kurita had watched his most powerful ship become a liability, forcing him to slow his entire force and drawing wave after wave of aircraft down onto his fleet. In the late afternoon, Kurita took a step that has been argued over ever since, temporarily reversing course, turning the whole center force westward, away from the San Bernardino Strait, and away from Leyte. The reasons behind that reversal were tangled. Part of it was simply to escape the relentless air attack, and part of it, some accounts hold, was a deliberate feint, a show of retreat meant to convince the American aviators overhead that the Japanese thrust had been broken. Whatever the mix of motives, Kurita turned back east later that same afternoon and pressed on toward the strait, leaving the mortally wounded Musashi behind. When his flagship passed the Musashi again around 20 past 4 in the afternoon, the great battleship was down some 8 meters at the bow and listing 10 degrees to port, and Kurita detached the cruiser Tone and several destroyers to escort her, then drove on toward his objective. He would carry his force through the San Bernardino Strait that night, and what he did the following morning, off the island of Samar, would become one of the most debated command decisions of the entire Pacific War. That is another story, and it belongs to the Yamato, not to her sister. For the Musashi, there would be no following morning. The man commanding the Musashi through this ordeal was Rear Admiral Toshihiro Inaguchi, who had taken command in August 1944. As the afternoon wore into evening, Inaguchi's ship was dying beneath him, and by 7:15 that evening, the list had reached 12 degrees, and Inaguchi gave the order to stand by to abandon ship. Then Inaguchi did something that has fixed him permanently in the ship's history. The admiral handed his personal notebook to his executive officer, Captain Kenkichi Kato, and retired to his cabin. He was not seen again. The contents of that notebook have become part of the ship's legend, and here honesty requires care. The notebook is understood to have contained Inaguchi's criticism of the fleet's inadequate anti-aircraft defenses, and by interpretation, it expressed his regret at the faith the Navy had placed in big guns and big ships. One account holds that, just before going down with his ship, Inaguchi expressed considerable regret at having placed so much faith in big guns and big battleships. Whether those were his exact words, we cannot fully verify. What we can say is that the commander of the most powerful gun-armed battleship ever built appears to have died believing that the entire idea behind his ship had been a mistake. Kato survived, and in his own later reflection, there is a note of something close to grim consolation. Kato wrote that he was pleased almost no damage had been sustained by the other vessels in the fleet during the battle, and that he somehow felt that, as the main target, the Musashi had managed to save the fleet. Read against the concentration of American attacks on his ship, that is a devastating thought. The Musashi may have served her fleet best not by fighting, but simply by being the biggest target in the water, soaking up the blows meant for everyone else. There had been one last hope, and it had failed. As the Musashi drifted, crippled, her officers considered trying to run her aground, to beach her in shallow water so she would not sink outright, and so her guns might still serve some purpose, but her engines stopped before she could reach any shore. The ship built to dominate the open ocean could not even drag herself onto a beach to die with dignity. She simply lost power and lay in the water, listing further and further, waiting. The end came quickly once it began. At 7:15 that evening, with the list at 12 degrees, Inaguchi had already given the order to stand by to abandon ship and handed over his notebook, and at 7:30, the list reached 30 degrees, and Captain Kato ordered the crew to abandon ship. 6 minutes later, at 36 minutes past 7 on the evening of the 24th of October, 1944, the Musashi capsized to port and sank by the bow. 2 explosions were heard as she went down. A survivor described the final minutes simply, that the Musashi was slowly listing to the left, and the survivors gathered at the third turret and slid down the starboard side of the hull into the sea. The same maneuver sailors have used to escape capsizing ships for as long as there have been ships to capsize. The cost was staggering. Of the roughly 2,399 men aboard, 1,023 went to the bottom with the ship. Among the dead were 143 survivors of the heavy cruiser Maya, which had been sunk the day before, men rescued onto the Musashi only to die on her the following day. The destroyers of the escort pulled well over 1,000 survivors from the water, but the largest battleship in that sea was gone, and the ship built to be unsinkable had taken more than 1,000 of her crew down with her. What happened to the survivors after the sinking is one of the least known and most brutal chapters of the whole story. The loss of the Musashi was treated as a state secret, and the survivors were not simply sent home to grieve. They were kept isolated, taken first to Manila and then to the fortified island of Corregidor, and some 200 were eventually sent home to Japan, some aboard the carrier Junyo, and some aboard the Musashi's own sister, the Yamato. A large number of the survivors met a far darker fate. Roughly 300 of the remaining men were divided among Japanese units defending the Philippines, sent to fight at places like Fort Drum, the concrete battleship fortress in Manila Bay, at Clark Field, and in the mountains, the Caraballo Range, and the Cabaruan Hills. Many were folded into the naval force defending Manila and were killed in that battle, and by one account, of a group of 146 Musashi men assigned to the defense of Manila, 117 were killed. Men who had survived the sinking of the largest battleship in the world were handed rifles and sent to die as infantry in a losing land campaign. Precisely so the story of their ship's death would not reach the Japanese public. Even the journey home was deadly. One transport carrying Musashi survivors back toward Japan was itself torpedoed, leaving men who had already lived through one sinking adrift in the water for some 19 hours before rescue. Picture that. A sailor swims away from the largest battleship ever sunk, is pulled from the Sibuyan Sea, and is then torpedoed a second time on the way home and left floating for the better part of a day. The secrecy that had surrounded the Musashi's birth followed her survivors all the way to their graves, and for many of them the graves came not on the ship, but scattered across the islands and waters of a campaign the ship never reached. Step back from the wreck and the death toll for a moment, and confront the question that hangs over the entire Yamato class, the question of whether these ships, the Musashi and her sister, were a magnificent achievement or one of the great strategic blunders of the war. This is a genuine argument among serious historians, and both sides have real evidence. One school of thought calls the Yamato-class battleships white elephants, a waste of scarce resources, and the reasoning is hard to dismiss. Japan was a resource-poor nation fighting an industrial giant, and every ton of steel, every barrel of fuel oil, every hour of skilled labor poured into these two enormous hulls was a ton, a barrel, and an hour not spent on the aircraft carriers, the escort ships, the aircraft, and the trained pilots the war actually turned on. The ships sacrificed speed and numbers for armor and gun size, betting everything on a kind of battle that never came. And by this reading, the Musashi was obsolete before her keel was even laid, a monument to a way of war that Midway had already buried. There is a serious counterargument, and it lives in the very difficulty of sinking her. Consider what it took, a large fraction of an entire American carrier fleet's air groups, flying repeated sorties over most of a day, concentrating on this one ship, to put her under. No aircraft carrier afloat could have survived that weight of attack, and before the middle of 1944, arguably no air force in the world could have delivered it. By this reading, the Musashi was not obsolete in some absolute sense. She was simply overtaken by one specific and overwhelming development, the sheer scale of American carrier air power, which grew so vast so quickly that it could afford to spend a day and hundreds of sorties drowning a single ship. The ships were not foolish. They were outbuilt, the way almost everything Japan made in that war was ultimately outbuilt. Here is the uncomfortable place where both arguments meet. It may be that the Musashi was at once a masterpiece of engineering and a strategic mistake, and that there is no contradiction in saying so. The men who designed her solved problems of metallurgy, of gunnery, of buoyancy and protection that no one had ever solved before, and they did it in service of a doctrine that was already dying. The tragedy of the Musashi is not that she was badly built. It is that she was perfectly built for the wrong war. Excellence and error are not opposites here. They are the same ship. For 70 years, the Musashi lay somewhere on the floor of the Sibuyan Sea, her exact position unknown. For different records gave 4 different locations for where she went down: the Japanese official position, the American official position, a Japanese destroyer's log, and a survivor's own drawing, and no two agreed. The search that finally found her was funded by the American technology billionaire Paul Allen, a co-founder of Microsoft, working from his yacht, the Octopus. The effort took roughly 8 years and drew on records from 4 countries. To reconcile those 4 conflicting positions, the team worked from a search area of some 360 square nautical miles, using an autonomous underwater vehicle and a remotely operated vehicle to comb the seabed. And on the 1st of March, 2015, their submersibles found the wreck lying at a depth of roughly 1 kilometer. On the 2nd of March, Allen announced the discovery to the world, noting the ship's bow, the chrysanthemum crest, the huge anchor, and he added a short line of respect for the men still with her, resting in peace, the crew of Musashi, approximately 1,023 lost. The identification was quickly confirmed by people with reason to be certain. The director of the Kure Maritime Museum, Kazushige Tadaka, said he was 90% sure from the location and depth alone, but the most powerful confirmation came from a man who had been there. A survivor of the sinking, Shigeru Nakajima, an electrical technician who had jumped overboard as the ship went down, saw the footage of the anchor and the Imperial Seal mount, and said he was certain. It was the Musashi. 70 years after he swam away from her in the dark, an old man recognized the ship that had nearly killed him, resting a kilometer down in the sea that had taken more than 1,000 of his crewmates. What the cameras found overturned a long-held assumption. For decades, it was believed the Musashi had sunk in one piece. She had not. The wreck lay broken apart across the seabed, because the ship had exploded underwater as she sank. The bow section, forward of the number 1 gun barbette, sits upright, while the stern lies upside down, and the forward superstructure and the funnel had torn away and come to rest separately on the seabed. The teak of the Imperial Chrysanthemum crest had long since rotted away, but its mount remained, alongside a 15-ton anchor, catapults, and the great gun turrets, scattered across a wide field of debris a kilometer beneath the surface. The discovery was not only an archaeological triumph. It reopened questions that had nothing to do with metallurgy. The site is a war grave, holding the remains of more than 1,000 men, and Allen's team stated their intention to work with the Japanese government to treat it respectfully as such. The find also stirred a jurisdictional dispute. The wreck lies in Philippine waters, off the province of Romblon, and Philippine authorities, including the Coast Guard and the National Museum, had not been notified in advance of the announcement. What one nation saw as recovering its own war dead, another saw as an archaeological site within its own territory. 70 years after her sinking, the Musashi was still a ship that crossed borders and complicated diplomacy, still generating consequences from a kilometer beneath the sea. And Paul Allen himself died in 2018, 3 years after the discovery that closed one of the last great mysteries of the Pacific War. We are left with 2 ships, built to the same plans, in the same class, for the same doomed doctrine. The Yamato lives on in Japanese memory in a way her sister never has. There is a major Japanese film built around the Yamato, released in December 2005, which became a commercial success and took in a record sum at the domestic box office. There is a famous animated franchise that carried the Yamato's name into space, and there is a maritime museum in Kure, popularly known as the Yamato Museum, built as the principal site of memory for the whole class. The Yamato became a myth, a symbol, an object of national mourning and fascination, while the Musashi, her identical twin, built to the same drawings and armed with the same guns, was found only in 2015 and remains comparatively forgotten. One officer of the Japanese naval staff once called these ships symbols of naval power that gave the officers and men a deep sense of confidence in their navy, and that confidence attached itself to one sister and largely passed the other by. Both ships were monuments to a single idea, that a war at sea would be decided by the biggest guns firing at the closest enemy, an idea the aircraft carrier had already killed before either ship ever fired those guns in anger. There is a famous saying often attached to these ships, a line that calls the world's three great follies the Great Wall of China, the pyramids, and the Great Japanese Battleship. It is a memorable phrase, and it is worth being honest about its origins. The version most often quoted comes from a popular post-war account, and the better documented telling of that line comes from a survivor's memoir of the Yamato, where it is placed in the mouth of a specific officer and applied to that ship rather than to the Musashi. So treat the neat quotation with caution. Whatever its exact provenance, the sentiment it captures is real, and it was shared by men who were there. The commander of the Musashi appears to have died believing the faith placed in big guns and big ships had been misplaced, and the saying survived because it named something true, even if the words themselves have been passed from ship to ship in the retelling. The Musashi never sank an enemy battleship, and she never fought the battle she was designed for. Her greatest service, if her executive officer was right, was to absorb the blows meant for the rest of her fleet, to be the largest target in the water and to die so that others might slip through. She was hidden behind a curtain at her birth, hidden from her own nation at her death, and hidden beneath a kilometer of ocean for 70 years after. Which leaves the hardest question of all, and it is not really a question about a ship. Japan poured a staggering fortune of steel, fuel, and industrial genius into two vessels that changed nothing about the outcome of the war. The men who designed the Musashi were among the most brilliant naval engineers who ever lived, and they spent that brilliance perfecting a weapon history had already made obsolete before the first rivet was driven. When a nation builds the most magnificent version of exactly the wrong thing and defends it long after the evidence has turned, the failure is not one of engineering. It is a failure of something harder to name, the willingness to keep believing in a coming battle that the world had already stopped fighting. That question of what exactly failed did not sink with the Musashi. It is still floating.